Okay, welcome everyone. I am really honored to be here with you. I've had the pleasure of attending this conference in person a couple of different times. And so I want to thank everybody behind the scenes at the Oregon RTI group who has made this conference possible. And before we really get started into content, I wonder if I could get a sense of what brought each of you here to this conversation about the science of reading today. So Shelby is going to help me out with the polls. So Shelby, I think we have question number one here related to why people decided to join this particular session today. What is it that's going on in your school, in your district, in your professional life that has you wanting to learn a little bit more about the science of reading? So let's take a look here. We'll give you a couple of seconds to respond. This is fun. It's like real time counters that are tallying up your responses. Okay. Do we have a way to tell how many people have responded? Almost everybody. Okay.
Yes, we're
Uh,
at 65%.
all right. Very good. So, final call. I'm going to give you just 3 more seconds and ask Shelby to close the poll in 3, 2, and 1. And it looks like many of you have the responsibility of teaching others about this topic. So I'm going to take that as perhaps we have a little bit more advanced group, but I also see some variety of responses here. Can you all see that? Are you seeing the poll responses? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So let's go ahead and start into what for me is the reason to talk about the science of reading, and that is the possibility of prevention. So, way back when I started in education, one of the most frustrating things for me was this dichotomy between the two worlds of general education system and the special education system. And I worked as a school psychologist originally, and I was part of that system of providing supports to students, and sort of serving as a gatekeeper back then for getting students into special education services. And special education was the only way that we had in my school system to support students who were struggling readers. And you had to be behind enough to get any support. So maybe some of you have had a similar experience and share that frustration. And I learned about some of the reading research very early on in my career that is captured on the slide that you see here on the screen. And one of the most important findings that is still true today is that it is possible actually to prevent reading failure for the vast majority of students. And it's much easier, much more efficient. It takes fewer resources to prevent a reading problem than to remediate it. And that's what you're looking at here. A way of measuring students' reading comprehension with an assessment like oral reading fluency. And what you're looking at is what happens for lots and lots of students in all different kinds of schools all around the country. And it's been documented for decades that once students are struggling readers at the end of first grade, they don't tend to catch up. That's what you're seeing with that red line as we're tracking students over time. And if you leave first grade sort of on that green pathway, you're likely to maintain that sort of typical reader, average reader kind of status. But you're probably already seeing a couple of things happening over time in this picture. And that includes the fact that the gap gets bigger over time, even in spite of providing intervention supports to students. It's very, very difficult to turn it around. There are individuals who catch up over time, but that's not the experience for the majority of students, unfortunately. So the good news is we have an opportunity early on in preschool if we have students before they come to kindergarten, certainly in kindergarten starting at day one, and in first grade, to teach students the skills that will make it much more likely that they will be readers on that green pathway as they leave first grade. So this is the really good news. But it does set up sort of a high priority or a critical time period in kindergarten and first grade, where what we do in the classroom can really change outcomes for students. It can actually prevent them from being struggling readers. So this is what to me is so powerful. It's the most powerful aspect of what we know in the reading research. I have a couple of points from some of Joe Torgeson's work here on the next slide about how important this is to get right early on because of what happens over time. Some people have called this the Matthew effect, that students who are struggling won't spend as much time reading. They don't choose to read in their free time. And this really limits their reading growth in a variety of ways. Reading is the way that we acquire new vocabulary primarily. So if you're not reading, you're not growing your vocabulary, you're not increasing your comprehension skills, you don't have as many opportunities to talk about what you're reading with your peers and so forth. And so it sort of spirals over time. So rather than getting students in that kind of a situation, we actually can teach in a way in kindergarten and first grade that will prevent that reading problem from happening in the first place. And in my experience with many districts over the years, what you do in the classroom is the number one variable in terms of outcomes. So two districts that are starting with very similar kinds of challenges in terms of the skills that students are coming in with at the beginning of kindergarten, those two districts can have very different outcomes at the end of kindergarten, depending on what they do in kindergarten and first grade. And I think that's powerful because it's not out of our control. It's actually within our control in the way that we organize our systems, in the way that we support teachers in classrooms to support students. So that's the goal. And when I think back to when I first started in education and what sort of set me on this pathway to learning more about the reading research, I think back to the fact that in my role as a school psychologist initially, I had a lot of training about what causes students to struggle with reading, about how to intervene when students are struggling readers. And the teachers I was working with didn't have the advantage of that knowledge. Their training was very different from mine, even though we were together, sometimes right next to each other in classrooms when we were in college in the same college of education, our training was very different. And I've spent a lot of years since then sort of learning more about why that is and trying to bridge that gap so that classroom teachers have the benefit of the knowledge about how we can prevent reading failure for students. So Shelby, I think we have a second poll question to ask folks to share a little bit about their training. Let me get a sense of what your training and teacher preparation was like, either as an undergraduate or a graduate student. So would you say that you felt prepared to teach reading effectively? Was that true for you or not true for you? And I could have placed a bet on your response to this based on my experience, but this is interesting the way it's playing out here. Okay, we have almost everyone who has responded. So let's go ahead and close the poll in 3, 2, 1, and we will share those results. Yeah, so 80% of you didn't feel that you were well prepared. This is the uh, same understanding that I have from interacting with lots and lots of educators, and this is really the mission that we're all on. Unfortunately, I guess not having the benefit of this in your prep program, but fortunately, you're interested in it now, and you're here now to learn more to benefit your students. So there's actually a national definition that's been created about what is the science of reading. And that's the website where you can go to see the definition that I have here on my screen. So www.whatisthescienceofreading.org. You can read about this consensus definition. You can use this definition in your work. Many of you said that you are responsible for informing others that you work with about the science of reading. So I invite you to use this definition and to actually sign on. There's a place on this website where you can join this movement to share about the science of reading. And what this definition is for me is a compilation of many decades, thousands and thousands of studies that give us the the firm standing give us the firm standing of what we can say that we know. So when we say the science of reading, we're talking about a specific type of research. We're talking about empirical studies where we haven't just investigated how something is happening, but we've actually looked at causes of why something is happening and which something works better than another in classrooms. And so that's really valuable and helpful for guiding your work in schools. So that's what we talk about as the science of reading. And in the hour that we have here today, I'm not attempting to fully represent what is in that body of research, but to just give you some overview kinds of ideas of what you could dig deeper into and learn about that might benefit your students. So I like to think about four categories of information that for me are part of the science of reading. And the first one is the why. So why should we be basing what we do in classrooms with students, how we organize our schools on reading research? What's the reason for doing that? And I think there's one really important reason that might be news to you. So that's where I want to start. So Shelby, I think we have a third um, poll question that we could pop up now. So we could get a sense of folks' response to this question, reading is natural, or the statement that reading is natural, that students will become readers when they're in a literacy rich environment, that they will uh, become students who love to read based on the way that we expose them to a literacy rich or a print rich environment. So your thoughts about that statement that reading is natural. Okay. All right, some people might be changing their answers the longer I give you to think about it. So let's go ahead and close the poll and see how this turned out. Most of you say that that's a false statement, and you are correct. Reading is not natural. And I think this is perhaps one of the most important or to some of us surprising findings from the reading research. When I started in education, there was a very strong belief that the environment was the most important factor to whether or not a student became a reader, that this was something that was innate in human brains, that we just had to present the right environment and experiences for, and it would naturally evolve or materialize. And what we found in lots of fields of study from looking at actual brain images is that there is no single area in our brains that's devoted to reading. And in fact, there are several areas of our brain that are devoted to other tasks that have to become connected and interrelated in a very specific way to cause reading to happen. So, this is one of the most fundamental understandings related to the reading research, that when you are teaching reading, you're actually rewiring children's brains, that we shouldn't take the stance that we should wait and see. This was very common when I was working in schools, that we would notice some signs in kindergarten or first grade. A parent would bring a concern to us at school. We would notice some struggles, but we would always take the stance that the student just wasn't ready for reading, and we should give the student the gift of time, and we should take this wait and see approach. And by the time the student was in third grade, they had developed so many bad habits, so many workarounds and coping mechanisms that were not helpful, And in many cases, they had checked out and were no longer interested or motivated to learn to read. And in other cases, developed some um, less appropriate, socially appropriate skills in the classroom to get their needs met. And that was really tragic to me and really educational and drove me to find out more about how reading actually develops. So I am not a neurologist, I'm not a cognitive scientist. So the representation of what's happening in children's brain that you're about to see is very low tech and probably not anatomically correct. But I want to try to communicate my understanding of what has to happen in students' brains and how we can support it with our work in schools, why this is important. So, when children come into preschool or kindergarten, what they tend to know a lot of, hopefully, is spoken words. They know the meanings of words, and they know something about how words work in oral language, in their language of oral communication. And when they're in kindergarten, we are working to draw their attention to the sounds in the words that they speak, right? Those phonemes. So we have a separate part of our brain that helps with the pronunciation of words. We are uh, we are able to become aware of those individual phonemes in spoken language. We're able to hear the phonemes. We're able to produce the phonemes. And that's something that we are actively working towards with our kindergarten students. And also in kindergarten, we're drawing students' attention to visual representations of words. We're teaching them about letter knowledge. We're teaching them letter names. We're teaching them um, the alphabet, the order of the alphabet, and so on. And instruction in kindergarten and moving forward can best support students to become readers when it is specifically and deliberately integrating across these different functions of our brain to create these connections so that students are eventually able to look at a printed word, pay attention to the individual, very specific sequence of letters in that printed word, have that word translated into speech by connecting those letters or graphemes to the phonemes, and then having the meaning of that word, once it's sort of translated into speech, activated in their mind. And that connection across those areas of our brain is what supports students to be able to look at a word in print and recognize it instantly. So instantly that you actually can't suppress the recognition of it. You can't make yourself not read the word when it is in front of you. It's that level of automaticity that's really needed to support students to understand what they're reading. So this has been captured for us in what's called the simple view of reading. And I'm using the same kind of color coding here to try to make connections across some of these slides for you. Um, the simple view of reading says that those skills that are related to the pronunciation of words, the letter sound relationship, and so on, we could sort of collapse into a category that we could call decoding or word recognition, and that category of skills interacts with the meaning of words, the ability to listen and follow spoken language, and the background knowledge that we have from our experiences in the world. And those two categories of skills come together to allow us to understand what we're reading. So, the simple view of reading captures these two skill areas into decoding and language comprehension and recognizes that it's the interaction of those two broad skill areas that causes students to understand what they're reading. And the simple view of reading is represented as a math problem. It's a multiplication formula, not an addition problem, but it's about the interaction of these two broad skill areas coming together to form reading comprehension. So this is a really important understanding that has been replicated for decades in the reading research. Originally a theory, now lots of research to suggest that this actually is how things are happening in children's brains, and that our instruction can support this to happen as we are teaching them to be readers. So the way this formula works is like a math problem. If students are automatic with their word recognition and decoding skills, but they lack skills in the area of language comprehension. So let's say um, perhaps students who have automatic decoding skills, they can read text fluently, but they still don't understand what they read. That's going to impact their reading comprehension. And the opposite is true as well. If students have grade level language comprehension skills, but they are lacking the ability to automatically decode and recognize words, their language or their reading comprehension will be impaired as well. Sometimes this is the case for some of our struggling readers or some of our English learners who've been brought to grade level with decoding skills, but perhaps not with their vocabulary or background knowledge. We need both of these skill areas to be, in place and highly functioning for reading comprehension to happen. So if you think like I do about young children, this gives you two categories of skills that you want to be teaching and that you want to make sure are taught in an integrated way. Not we're going to have our reading time and then we're going to have our spelling time, but these skills are integrated for young children. That's how we support reading comprehension to happen. And if you want to think about older struggling readers, the simple view helps to sort of tease out why might a student in third grade and above be having difficulty with reading comprehension? Is it because they're lacking language comprehension skills, and or are they lacking word recognition and decoding skills? So it gives you a place to go for sort of um, instructionally relevant diagnostic assessment when you have this picture, this graphic of the simple view of reading in mind. Okay, so that gives you a little bit about the why. So, powerful pieces from the reading research here include the fact that reading is not natural and that it requires the combination of word recognition, the interaction of word recognition and language comprehension. Not that we're teaching one or the other, but that we are teaching both and that we're doing that in an integrated way. So, what is it that we should be teaching to students? The reading research provides a lot of information here about what is important to teach. So, let me ask Shelby to share with us the next uh, poll question, if you would. Um, so, I still have three on my screen. So, I think we're going to take a look at number 4, a question about phonemes in words. And so I'm asking you here to identify the third phoneme in the word brick. So think about the word brick. Maybe don't even look at the word brick. That's a little cue to be helpful to you. What's the third phoneme? So this depends on background knowledge. What is a phoneme? That smallest unit of spoken sound. What is the third phoneme in brick? Okay. We've got our responses coming in, and it's neck and neck between two choices here. Okay, we're going to close the poll in 3, 2, and 1 and see how you did. So 67% of you thought that the third phoneme was I, and 32% thought the third phoneme was k. Okay, very interesting. The third phoneme in brick, here are the phonemes b, I, k. And it does help to not look at the letters. It does help to not look at the word b, I, k. So I is the third phoneme in brick. And some of you might have been tripped up by that blend at the beginning of brick. A blend includes two phonemes. Each letter is representing a separate phoneme. And that's the level of awareness of spoken language that we want young children by the end of kindergarten to achieve. Because our English language in writing is representative of the phonemes that we speak. So what we write down in English is not syllables, it's not entire words or phrases. What we write down in English is the individual phonemes of our speech. So this is a third really, really important finding from research. And this is one of those ironclad kind of research findings about the value and importance of phoneme awareness. I'm sort of categorizing it on this slide as part of the decoding and word recognition um, component of the simple view of reading, that when students can identify the individual speech sounds in spoken language, that they are much more likely to become readers. This is a skill we want every single student to acquire. With young children in kindergarten or our older struggling readers, many of them are missing phoneme awareness, and we should teach it to them. It's not too late. That's a place we should intervene if a student is struggling with this skill. So what it involves is this very abstract understanding that our speech can be broken up into individual phonemes. We don't speak in phonemes, but we can become aware that there are parts to our spoken words, like the word cat has the sounds k, a, t. That's really, really productive for then a student who wants to look at CAT and be able to read cat, or a student who wants to be able to write the word cat. We need to have that relationship between phonemes and graphemes really well established for students. So that is an essential understanding of becoming a reader. Back in the year 2000, there was a very careful summary of the reading research that concluded there are 5 essential components of becoming a reader, 5 skills that are worth our time, not individual skills, but skill areas that are worth our time in instruction in K to 3. And those are the ones that you see listed here, phonemic awareness being at the top of the list. So this is one of the first essential skills. Now, when I say essential, I don't mean like it would be great if kids, could learn this skill. I mean, every student needs to know that the spoken word cat has 3 phonemes and be able to produce them k, a, t, by the end of kindergarten. That the research is really clear on the value of that particular piece of information, that particular task and skill. So it's important for all students to acquire that. Kindergarten is also really important for building oral language, building vocabulary, and these skills can happen hand in hand. And in fact, they should. It's easier for students to learn to segment the sounds in words they know the meaning of. So you can take a basic word like pit, but if a student doesn't know what a pit is, it's going to be harder for them to make those connections between the meaning, the word meaning part of their brain, and the phoneme processing part of their brain. So um, teaching these skills in an interrelated way is really important. We also want students to be able to do the connection between sounds and symbols. We talk about the alphabetic principle as the awareness that it is letters that represent the sounds that we speak. And we talk about phonics as that system of those letter sound relationships that we can teach students. That leads to being able to read text accurately and automatically enough that you can understand what you're reading. You can imagine where those language comprehension skills and word recognition skills come together for reading comprehension. Okay, so I'm going to give you just a little bit different representation of those 5 skill areas and try to communicate the interaction between these. So I mentioned that phonemic awareness is one of those early essential skills. It's not a single skill. There are lots of phonemic and phonological skills that students might acquire. But what's essential by the end of kindergarten is blending and segmenting phonemes. Those are two really high value targets for the end of kindergarten. And this is something that starts developing in students before they come to kindergarten. It can be supported in pre-K, it can be supported at home. But if students don't have it when they enter kindergarten, this is really important to provide intentional instruction on starting in kindergarten. When students are able to segment words like cat into k, at, then it's really important to start adding letters into that instruction, because the purpose of being aware of phonemes is so that you can map speech to print. You start to get that letter sound or phoneme grapheme relationship that's going to support automatic word reading. So I've kind of blurred the lines between these skill areas. I could draw an arrow that would go back and forth, because once you start to connect sounds to letters, to be able to write cat and read cat, that increases your ability to do more advanced phoneme tasks, to be able to add phonemes to words, to delete phonemes from words, and so on. There is also a relationship between your knowledge of letter sound and your ability to read words with increasingly more difficult patterns and your oral reading fluency. These also go hand in hand. There's a reciprocal relationship here. And as I started with that graph of oral reading fluency over time, the green line and the red line, there's quite a reciprocal relationship between fluency and reading comprehension. So students who are accurate and fluent readers are much more likely to understand what they're reading. And as you become better and more skilled with reading comprehension, your fluency also will increase. It goes in both directions. And I'm representing the vocabulary and oral language skills here along the side to show that it's not a sort of progression with this category of skills like it is with the others, you know, what comes earlier or sooner and how it develops. But oral language and vocabulary is sort of constant. If you want to think about even just the K to 6 range of skills, those skills should always be the focus of instruction and always be increasing and developing. So we've talked about the importance of some of the research findings, why we want to base instruction in the science of reading. We've talked a bit about what the skills are that we want to be supporting. And now we can talk a little bit about what research can lend to us in terms of the best ways to teach these skills. So I'll draw on some of the effective instruction research. Um, I mentioned that I have attended the Oregon conference in past years, and it's been my pleasure to attend Anita Archer's presentations because she is the queen of communicating about effective instruction. So some of the ideas here about what makes instruction more powerful, more efficient, more effective for beginning readers include breaking down the tasks into smaller units. This is true for lots of skills, especially true for beginning reading skills. Scaffolding by way of the we do it step of Anita Archer's I do it, we do it, you do it cycle, so that we're doing that supported practice as much as needed with students when they're acquiring these new skills. And then we're gradually releasing the student once they're accurate to practice to automaticity on their own. That we're sequencing our skills. This is a really, really important element of the reading research. You'll see this come up again in a future slide, that we are intentionally moving through a sequence of skills that generally goes from simple to complex. There's no reason to overwhelm students with the whole enchilada, so to speak, from the beginning. We can look at the individual elements that make up that delicious dish in an order that will make it more digestible for the student. That we can take the burden of discovering how to read away from students and actually explicitly show them the skills that are the components of what they need to become a skilled reader. And as we're providing that supportive feedback in the we do it step, we can correct mistakes very intentionally and immediately so that students learn from those experiences and are more likely to give a correct response in the future. So, the terms that you're likely to hear when you investigate the effective reading research include explicit, right? So, the idea here is um, maybe the opposite of discovery. So, there's a time and a place for discovery learning. There's a time and a place for students to investigate, to work collaboratively, to work on projects together, to direct their own learning. But when it comes to beginning reading, or when it comes to struggling readers, older struggling readers, we don't have time to allow them to make mistakes in that sort of discovery process. There's one right answer. There is a tried and true sequence that can be helpful. There are known patterns of words that are more frequent. So we should teach those first, right? So that relates to the explicit nature of beginning reading instruction that's more likely to be effective. When we think about systematic instruction, you can see some of the characteristics in the middle column here, but I'd also encourage you to think about teaching reading from the perspective of a variety of language systems. This is something that not a lot of people or not enough people talk about, and I think is really missed in many teacher preparation programs. That becoming a reader depends on your knowledge of, of the English language at a variety of levels. So, the systems that I was referring to that have to interact in your brain, um, the phonological system, the orthographic system, systems of morphology, the layers of language, the language structures that we can access and teach to students so that they have um, at the ready when they are trying to understand text that they're reading. So that's what I think of as a system of language that we can bring to bear in reading instruction. And then here's that idea again of sequential, um, not starting with text, but starting with skills that build to understanding text, being sequential, moving from simple to complex. So here's how those ideas of explicit, systematic, sequential might play out in the skill areas, those five essential skill areas that I mentioned. And I'm just drawing a contrast in this column between explicit literacy instruction and what you might see in a more typical uh, or balanced literacy type of classroom. So, in the area of phoneme awareness, as I said, this is one of the most essential skills for young children. It's often not part of a balanced literacy approach to instruction, or if it is, it's kind of incidental or an afterthought. And in some cases, honestly, I've heard teachers being directed not to break words into their individual phonemes, that somehow that is reductionist or taking away from meaning. And so, what we know now in the reading research is the value of the phoneme for getting to that letter sound relationship that's essential for reading comprehension. When it comes to oral language, again, I think about intentionality and the purposefulness of classroom discussions, and in particular, reading aloud to students. So, building background knowledge, building listening comprehension, building word knowledge and word meanings in an intentional and purposeful way. Phonics and spelling instruction that's explicit, systematic, and sequential will build from the ground up, so to speak. It'll start with the phoneme, with all of the phonemes, all 44 phonemes of the English language, and systematically teach students the graphemes that can represent those speech sounds in print. And do that in a way that has students not learning phonics as an isolated skill, but has them learning it for the purpose of getting meaning from text. And that relates to the text reading component, the oral reading fluency component. A difference here is that the text that students are reading in explicit literacy instruction is controlled to be inclusive of patterns, letter sound patterns that the teacher knows the student has read accurately. So that decodable text is for the purpose of practicing those letter sound associations that the teacher has taught and the student has shown that he or she can read accurately. So it's for building that automaticity, lots and lots of practice in the decodable text, like sort of controlling the environment that the student is reading so that they have a successful reading experience. As opposed to what we often see in classrooms, which is the use of leveled text that's not controlled for difficulty in terms of decoding. And students might experience patterns in a leveled text that they haven't yet been taught. And that can result in a lot of mistakes, which definitely impacts comprehension, which is the last skill area, and can also be taught with those underlying language structures in mind in a very intentional and purposeful way. Okay, so let's talk now about the last category that I use to um, kind of think about the science of reading, and it's one that maybe others don't bring to light quite as much, but I think about the when and where um, to teach these things as the structures that allow them to happen in schools. This is what I think of as MTSS, the systems that support the science of reading to come to life in classrooms, to be delivered in classrooms, to be effective, to improve outcomes for students in classrooms. So you could think about this as uh, who needs what kind of instruction, when and where do they need it? Those kinds of decisions is what I'm thinking about here. So in my when and where category, um, I include the importance of assessment. So that's going to let you know who needs what. I include the database decision making framework of a collaborative problem solving model that is central to MTSS. And I include the coordination and integration of these kinds of ideas. So assessment for me is really central to an MTSS model and to the science of reading, because if we're going to get all students to grade level expectations, we need a system of assessments that will answer certain questions for us. Sometimes people think about assessment in kind of a negative way. It's something that somebody told you you had to do. But I'd like to encourage you to think about assessment as being helpful in guiding what you need to do. What does each student need you to do? So before we talk about the assessment systems, I think Shelby has a poll question number 6. If you don't mind, Shelby, skipping to number 6 in that list of polls. I don't know if that's possible. Hopefully that's possible. Yeah, so I want to know from you, um, of these 4 assessment purposes that I'm going to share a little bit about, which ones, screening, diagnostic, progress monitoring, or outcome evaluation, do you have in your school? So you can provide more than one response. You might have more than one taken care of in your school. Let's get a sense of which one might be missing. Okay, we can close the poll and see how it turned out. Interesting. Okay, so outcome evaluation is the one that you probably are just not as familiar with, and that might be why people said that they didn't have it. I'm really interested that so many people said that they have diagnostic assessments. That's great. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what each of these purposes are and how they relate to the science of reading. Um, in your school system, you need tools that answer the question, which students are at risk and which systems are at risk. So this is universal screening, 3 times a year, checking in with all students on important indicators like those big five that we were just speaking about. You also need more in-depth diagnostic assessments that answer the question, what should we teach next? So screening will tell you that a student is um, not on track for future reading outcomes, but you need a diagnostic assessment to inform you about exactly what to teach next. Screening will give you a broad category. For example, the student needs support in phonemic awareness. Diagnostic assessment will tell you specifically they're not able yet to blend phonemes. Okay. You also need progress monitoring assessments that will tell you if your instruction is working. This is like the GPS for teachers. It tells you where is the student now. It drops a pin. Where do you want the student to be in the future? So what's going to increase the odds that the student would be an okay reader in the future? How far do we need to go? Progress monitoring will chart that course for you, and it will give you the real-time feedback as you're traveling along that route. Are you on track or have you gotten off course? And do you need to stop and reevaluate what you're doing? Just like the GPS will tell you, that it's redirecting you. That's what progress monitoring does, so that you can make real-time decisions about should you keep teaching what you're teaching in the way you're teaching it, or should you make a change? And then outcome evaluation is just simply that sort of end of grade level assessment. Did the student achieve the outcomes for that grade? Did they meet the grade level standards? This is sort of like your group administered achievement testing that you're all probably doing. Now, the database decision making framework that we use our assessments in is called collaborative problem solving. And you might use a problem solving process that's 5 steps or 7 steps or 12 steps. I'm showing a 4-step version. There's nothing magic about it. The basic sequence is the same no matter how many steps you use. But this is a framework that gives you the questions that you need to ask about the whole grade level of students and about individual students, and helps guide you to choose which assessment to use to answer each question. So you're going to start with what is the problem? Screening data is really useful for answering that. And you can define the problem as the difference between what you expect. I expect 100% of my kindergartners to segment phonemes at the end of the year versus the actual situation. Actually, 42% of my kindergartners are segmenting phonemes at the end of the year. That's really helpful for moving into problem analysis, where diagnostic assessment can be helpful. Why are so few students segmenting phonemes at the end of the year? What's causing that? What variables about the students, what variables in the curriculum, what variables about your instruction, what variables about the instructional environment contribute to that problem statement? And then developing a plan about what to do about it, whether it's for an individual student or for an entire grade level or school. And then here's where progress monitoring comes in to answer the question, did it work? Is it working for us now? Did what we did last week or last month work for the student? And that allows us to go right back up to the top if we need to. So there's kind of some comfort here in the cyclical nature of this process. Okay, Shelby, I think we have one last poll question that relates to tiers of instruction and the 3-tiered model. So question number 7, before we talk a little bit about those tiers. So here's the true, false, or yes, no statement. At my school, students come out of tier 1 instruction to get reading intervention. Is that happening at your school? Yes or no? Okay, we're going to close the poll in 3, 2, and 1. And we're split about 60-40. So About 40% of you said that students come out of tier one instruction to get reading intervention support. That is a common practice. I'm going to suggest to you that that might not be the most helpful practice when it comes to preventing reading failure. So, this image, I'm sure you have a more sophisticated graphic about the three-tiered model, but the image represents the systems of support that will allow all students to be on track with reading skills at any grade level. That's what this model is about. Engineering a system of increasingly intensive instructional supports that all students can access based on their need from day one of kindergarten. So, this is the specific alternative to the wait to fail model that I used to work in. This model is organized to put all of that excellent research on prevention into place and to be able to efficiently use resources to meet every student's need. So, um, many other presentations about this topic, but to connect it to the science of reading specifically and back to prevention, I would encourage you to think about your three-tier model as three tiers of prevention of reading failure. That's where this model originated, is with public health and disease prevention, actually. And so, tier one instruction, what people call core instruction, what all students are accessing for, let's say, 90 to 120 minutes, needs to be lined up to the needs of the students in front of you. So, this is why we do universal screening, is to find out what are the needs of the students at the grade level so that our first reading instruction can match those identified needs. So, we don't go from screening to who needs intervention, we go from screening to how should we organize our classroom reading instruction at tier one. That's a component that many folks are missing. That's your best opportunity to prevent reading failure. So, making sure that you're addressing both the language comprehension and the word recognition and decoding skills in those early grades in tier one instruction in a way that is matched to the student's current skills. Um, so, that instruction in the regular classroom should cause the majority of students, we just use 80%, to get to the grade level goals, the grade level expectations, not from any intervention, not from any additional support, but the majority of students should be on track because of the regular classroom instruction. That's where students are spending most of their instructional minutes. That's your best opportunity to meet their needs. Some students are going to need something in addition to their regular classroom reading instruction. That's what we call strategic support. That's what we call tier two or core plus, right? So students get that extra dose of instruction if they are at risk. And they shouldn't come out of their 90 to 120 minutes of tier one instruction to get that extra dose. Otherwise, it wouldn't be extra, right? So that should be at another time of day. That means we can't do it with too many students. That's the job of core instruction. And then that extra dose, in addition to tier one support, should get another 15% of students to the grade level expectations. Not that they score below expectation, but that tier one plus tier two should get another 15% of students to the grade level expectations. And then it's going to take something even more individualized and intensive to get that last 5% of students to the grade level expectations. So here's a little bit more detail about each of those um, tiers of support or tiers of prevention of reading failure if we want to think about young students. Okay, I'm sure there are some questions that have been coming in, so let's wrap up so that we have time to let some folks get those questions answered. So in conclusion, all students still deserve to learn to read, and they deserve teachers who are knowledgeable and able to put into practice what is known from the research to be more likely to get students to be readers. What and how to teach, and what are the systems of support that can be implemented when and where to make sure that all students become readers. What we know in the reading research about how children learn to read can help us make decisions in the classroom about the way that we teach and about what we teach. And those are the variables that are more important than anything else. What you do as a teacher in the classroom truly changes lives for students. And there's a vast body of reading research that can help inform what you do in the classroom to help make you a more efficient and effective teacher. I'm going to encourage you to focus on prevention. If you're working with older students, there's lots of value in the information that I've shared for intervention as well. Okay, I have a couple of resources that I'll share because some of you might be wanting to know, where do I go to learn more about this? You only flew over a topic and mentioned it briefly. I know. So a couple of places to go to explore. The Oregon RTI website is one of my favorite tools for exploring more about these topics, so I encourage you to go there. Voyager Sopris Learning is one of the places where you can find good quality webinars on the science of reading. If you are a parent or an educator, you can seek support from local International Dyslexia Association branches or your Decoding Dyslexia chapter. There are a couple of documents. One that I love from Louisa Moats called Teaching Reading is Rocket Science. You can find on the AFT website. And a group called EAB has published a document called Narrowing the Third Grade Reading Gap. That is an excellent introduction to the science of reading. I really love Emily Hanford's podcasts. They're a great place to start. If you want to go more in depth, I've got a couple of PD recommendations here for you. And if you are more of a video person than a PD or reading person, a couple of YouTube, a couple of Facebook places that you could go, and of course, a couple of books where you could learn more. So I know this was a quick overview and introduction. I hope you're not feeling overwhelmed. I want to encourage you to take a deep breath, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. Take a small step. Every small change that you make will be impactful for the students that you touch. And don't feel bad or guilty or frustrated about not knowing some of this information until now. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, you can do better. Okay, Nicole, are you fielding questions for us?
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie. So many good points that you brought up. A fantastic overview. We do have a few questions that have come through. So the first question is there anything in the research literature about the effectiveness of running records?
So I can't cite chapter and verse on research on running records, but I can tell you that running records are primarily an assessment for error analysis. So um, a student has to be reading before you can do one. And it's about monitoring and then responding to the errors that a student makes when they're reading, giving teachers information about how to respond to students' errors. And so I would say that that is in opposition to what is in the reading research about preventing reading problems. We don't have to wait until a student has a reading problem. We don't have to wait for assessments that just are having students read text. There are assessments we can use prior to when they're able to read text that will help us make predictions and really change the course of who's going to be an effective reader of text. So I would say that a running record is not lined up with that approach of equipping students with those foundational skills early on for the purpose of preventing them from having a reading problem.
Okay, thank you. We have another question that's come through in the chat, and thank you all. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So the next question is, what do you see as the best approach for reading specialists slash support staff to offer intervention support?
The best approach for reading interventionists or support staff, how can they best serve students?
Yeah, that's what it sounds like, offering intervention support.
Offering intervention support.
Hmm.
Um, so one of the very best ways that reading support people who are not classroom teachers can support reading outcomes is by coming to the regular classroom to help support that small group differentiation. Um, as I said, where students spend most of their reading instructional minutes is the regular classroom. And so that presents the best opportunity for us to match our instruction to the needs of the students. And that's harder to do in whole group than it is in small group. And especially as students get older and can perhaps be farther and farther behind their classmates, it's extremely difficult to meet everybody's needs in a whole group format. So when we talk about tier one and we talk about core reading instruction, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're spending that time all in whole group. In fact, it's the opposite of that. That you're making decisions based on your screening data about which skills to teach in whole group and which skills to teach in small group. So reading specialists, reading interventionists can be really helpful in being part of that tier one differentiation where the entire grade level is put into flexible skill-based small groups. Everybody in that small group has the same need, the same next step for instruction, and the classroom teacher and the reading specialist can work with the most struggling students. They're the ones who need the most opportunities to practice. They're going to need the most repetition. They might need the most explicit instruction. And so those highly skilled classroom teachers and reading specialists can work with those most struggling students in those small groups. And at the same time, perhaps paraprofessionals or even can work with the other students who are not struggling quite as much, or those students can be working cooperatively or in partners. So that would be the model that I would suggest for how best to use reading specialists. I'm saying that especially right now when schools are um, very concerned about intervention, and there's a lot of federal and state money that is being made available to help schools combat the learning loss that has been the result of the pandemic and students missing education. Um, Many people are conceptualizing that funding as the way that it's stated, intervention. And I want to really encourage people to think about bringing those resources to bear on the first reading instruction. There's never going to be enough intervention people or intervention minutes to counteract uh, first reading instruction in tier one that is over the heads of the students in that grade level. Um, so I want to really encourage people to reconceptualize the way that they think about reading intervention. If we can get it right in tier one, that will reduce the number of students who need something extra. It'll reduce the number of students who are at risk. It will free up the very intensive resources at tier two and tier three for those students who really need them. So that would be my suggestion for reading intervention folks.
Absolutely. I totally agree with the importance of that primary instruction. So powerful. Um, so, our next question is, and relatedly, or connected to this, what are your thoughts on struggling readers in middle and high school? Does intervention look similar?
Yes. In middle school and high school, your biggest challenges are about my fourth component, the what and where of the science of reading, um, because the schedule is so different. The teaming aspect among staff, the curricular expectations are so challenging in middle school and high school that it's the what and where that really looks different. Um, so how do you organize your systems to deliver reading intervention in middle school and high school? That's where the challenge is. Um, in terms of the skills, I would say that the essential skills that students have to acquire are the same. So whether you're equipping young children and trying to prevent reading failure, or you're trying to intervene on an older student's reading difficulty, what happens in your brain when you're a reader is the same. And the list of things that can cause difficulty with that in older students is the same. And the instructional approaches that are effective for correcting reading problems, intervening on reading problems, are the same. You're just going to need more of it. So one of the things that you'll see in the reading research, for example, is the amount of time that it will take for students in kindergarten to learn to segment phonemes might be something like, don't quote me on this, but ballpark 15 minutes a day for, I don't know, 3 months, let's say. What it takes to intervene for a secondary student who's a struggling reader is something more like an hour and a half of reading intervention every day. So what you're doing during that intervention is the same wiring of the brain, right? Connecting speech to print, practicing the automatic word recognition to the point that students' brains can be freed up to focus on the meaning of the text. Those are the same skills. And what's effective with young children is also effective with older students, but it's going to take more time. It's going to take more intensity is the word that you hear people use to describe. And by that, we mean more repetitions, more explicit, so smaller steps, more structure in terms of the sequencing of easier to harder. And there's more skills to make up when students are older. You've got more ground that you have to go back through. So those would be the similarities and differences between the grade bands.
Okay, perfect. Our next question, and I'm just addressing these in the order that I'm receiving them, is about measuring language comprehension.
Mhm.
And so I'm just going to read. So most diagnostics out there give more data on phonological deficits and phonics deficits, but not necessarily language comprehension. So since that would be oral understanding of students. Do you have advice on a way to measure that language comprehension outside of anecdotal?
Mhm. Yeah, so the reason there aren't good tools is because these are really complex interrelated skills that are extremely difficult to measure, right? Like there's a finite list of phoneme grapheme correspondences, and like you can lay that out there and assess them in a very discrete way. That's not the case when it comes to the language processes that underlie reading, like morphology and syntax and inference, and all of the related processes, like RAN and working memory. The research isn't as clear about how those components work together, how they contribute to reading comprehension, how or if they're different from reading comprehension. All of that is emerging research. Two tools that I know of that I think are helpful for directing instruction in that language comprehension realm. One I know next to nothing about, and the other one I know a lot about. So the one that I'm just personally learning about and don't know very much about, so this is not in any way an endorsement, is called Cubed. And maybe, Nicole, you guys have investigated Cubed and could add to that. But that's one that I would encourage people to look into. And the other one is Acadians Reading Diagnostic for Comprehension, Fluency, and Oral Language. I used to work for the authors of Acadians Reading, and the diagnostic for comprehension, fluency, and oral language, of course, is shorthanded to CFOL, CFOL. And it is a way for teachers who have students who are perfectly adequate with the word recognition side of the simple view. They can read text accurately and fluently, but they're still not understanding what they're reading. Or that kindergarten student who you're already recognizing is having difficulty with language comprehension. Maybe you're noticing their vocabulary and word knowledge is low, or they're mixing up um, word endings and you're questioning their morphology, or they have a difficult time even telling you what happened over the weekend, right? Those kinds of cues that you're getting with kindergarten students. The Acadians Reading Diagnostic CFAL has elements, sections that will assess listening comprehension, passage retell, oral reading fluency, but also vocabulary, morphology, syntax, and grammar. And it's one of the few tools out there that is teacher friendly. Reading specialists can use it, special educators, classroom teachers, and it is directed at instruction. So it's not about diagnosing a disability, it's about what's the next skill I should teach? Where should I focus some instructional time in support of language comprehension skills? So those would be two to investigate.
Perfect. We are running up on our um, allotted time. Unfortunately, we do have some other questions that have come through. And I do want to point to everyone and encourage Shelby, if you could repost that in the chat. We do ask participants to offer us feedback on both this session and at the end of today's conference. We definitely use that feedback and information in adjusting what we offer. And so we are up on time. So unfortunately, we can't get to that last question. Stephanie, you put your perfect. You have your contact information there.
Yeah.
See, you're right. You're right on it. And so those of you who have other burning questions, you can contact Stephanie at that contact information. Please, please, please take a moment. It really helps us to fill out our quick survey feedback. And I just want to thank you so much. I'm deeply embedded in this work, and I feel like I learn something from you every time that I either see you in person or interact with you. Thank you so much. I think this was a very powerful introduction to the science of reading in a very approachable way. Thank you for taking time to answer questions. Deeply appreciate it. And so thank you, Stephanie. And that is all the time we have. Again, follow up and also seek out those handouts and resources that are in that Google Drive folder that is available for you all to do deeper learning and take back with you.
Thank you all so much. Thanks, Nicole and Shelby, for your support and for this wonderful conference. Hope everybody has a great rest of their day.
Yeah, have a great one. See you at the
Thanks.
next session.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.